So here with this opening activity, what I tried to do, and I want to thank you, these are all really great ideas and points of what the purpose of an assessment is. What I tried to do and what you made it a little bit difficult for me to do is to separate it based on what are things that are centered around the students and what the students get out of assessment versus what maybe the teacher gets out of assessment, right? So, you're understanding their progress or their understanding of the material, so you can use that as feedback for your own teaching versus having the students use that for their own feedback of their own progress or maybe for motivation for the students. And so we kind of wanted to set this up to use this to set the stage for our discussions today and how we can try and make our assessments really benefit our students and how we can approach equity in assessments with these students in mind. And so that's just kind of as a little primer for what we'll do the rest of the day. There we go. So it's kind of, integrating your assessments into teaching purposes related to instructor goals versus student goals. So today we'll try and talk about how we can kind of work these two together and really focus on students and the equity and making students all feel welcome.
Great, thanks, Katie. So our official welcome. Welcome everybody to the CEILS series of workshops, Teaching Equitably Online. We are in part 2, which is assessment design. CEILS is Center for Education, Innovation, and Learning in the Sciences, if you haven't heard of us. We are a STEM center for teaching and learning here at UCLA. We have a ton of resources on our website, so feel free to peruse those as you wish. And we, as I said, we are recording this. If anyone has any issues with privacy, you're free to keep your video off. We'll only use this recording for instructional purposes. And if not, we really encourage you to put your video on. It does help us really create some community. It also helps everybody be present with the process of what we're doing and how we're talking to each other. So we really do want to encourage you, if possible, to keep your video on for the workshop. Next slide, please. So our focus for today is to create more equitable assessments, and we're going to ask you to really rethink some strategies for evaluating student performance, competency, and mastery. Our big picture is what we're going to start with. Why do we even think about assessments in terms of effectiveness and also in terms of equity? We'll learn a little bit about what we learned from the spring quarter, especially from the student perspective. We'll give you a list of a bunch of resources that the cross-campus committee recommended in terms of alternative assessments. We'll discuss a whole range of alternatives that you may be interested in terms of integrating into your course, and we'll ask you to apply some of those. When I say alternatives, I mean alternative to the traditional proctoring type exam. And we also know that some people may still be wanting to use a remote proctoring tool or remote proctoring exam as part of their assessment, so we will talk about the best practices for that as well. Next slide. So I'm Rachel Kennison. I'm the interim director for CEILS. My background is in life sciences. And I'm just going to go around and introduce everybody on our team briefly, but while I'm doing that, we'd like you to actually put your discipline in front of your name, and you'll do this by renaming yourself, and this is because we're going to put you in small groups by discipline. So the way that you do that, if you hover with your mouse over your video, you should see 3 dots, and if you click on those 3 dots, you'll see look down and you'll see rename as an option, and you click on that, and then you can just write your discipline in parentheses or whatever, and your name, so that we know which discipline you're in and how we will best be able to group you. So as I said, I'm Rachel. Shauna Shaked will be here shortly. She's our Senior Associate Director. Her background is in physics. And then we have Katie, who you've already heard from, Katie Dixie, and she is our Assistant Director. Her background is also in life sciences. And then we have 3 amazing graduate student researchers with us this summer from CEILS. We have Kiana Fox, if you want to just wave your hand, Kiana. And she is from higher ed and organizational change. We have Ben Ha, who is our GSR from EEB, from Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, and Sammy or Samantha Mensa, and she is a PhD candidate in materials chemistry. So we've got a variety of different fields that are represented here. And then we also have Dr. Jenny Casey, and she is here. She's a chemistry instructor, and she's been also helping us with our workshops and helping to facilitate. So a big shout out to our team. It's a real team effort, very appreciative of everyone's contributions. So if you're having any trouble renaming yourself, let us know. I think that looks pretty good. Looks like everybody seemed to figure that out pretty well. Great. All right, so we'll go to the next slide. So we've mentioned a few times that we're talking about equity and how to teach equitably and think about assessments equitably. And so before we dive into that, I just want to really be clear about these words and what they mean and make sure we're all on the same page. Oftentimes, equality and equity are confused and people use them interchangeably, but the definitions of these two terms are really quite different. When we think about equity, we think equity is something that we seek in order to ensure fair treatment, equality of opportunity, so making sure everyone gets opportunities, and the fairness to access for information and for resources for all students. Equality is when we think about, we're just treating everybody the same, right? Which is not fair when not all students are given the same opportunities and the same resources. And also sometimes the same respect or dignity, right? So if you look at this picture, you see if we give everybody the same bicycle and expect them all to get to the same place, but they are different, they're coming with different strengths and different limitations, that's going to be quite challenging. But in terms of equity, if we make the bike fit the person and help that bike fit the person, then they will all have a fair and equal opportunity to be able to reach the goals that we are asking them to reach. And we think about inclusivity, which is another word that we throw around. Inclusive teaching really describes the range of approaches to teaching, right, that really respect and honor the diverse backgrounds of all our students. So it's really about creating a culture of belonging by actively inviting the contributions and participation of all our students. So I just wanted to be clear first to start us off with those definitions, and then moving on to the next slide. And so why are we thinking about equity when we talk about assessment or when we talk about designing in our teaching? We want to think about the big picture, the historical context here, right? Higher education institutions were really founded and designed to serve white students, and particularly those who are male, middle to upper class, heterosexual, able-bodied, and Christian. But we know, and you can click on the next animation, please. Thank you. We know that our students really represent a huge diversity, right, of both those identities that we can see, but also those identities that are hidden, right? And yet our educational practices and policies have not yet been reconfigured to equitably support, affirm, and validate students with all those different backgrounds and identities, and particularly those from underrepresented groups in STEM. Next animation. So we want to approach this in terms of, as instructors, we have this opportunity, right, to really affirm the belonging of the underrepresented students in higher ed. One example of that might be of representing their experiences in course materials, but we're going to talk today, focus mostly on assessments and how designing a variety of different types of assessments can really help increase opportunities for all of our students to succeed. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to go to talk a little bit about some of the lessons that we learned from spring quarter, and I'm going to hand this off to Katie.
Right, so when we're thinking of spring quarter, it was kind of a very quick shift for all of us, for us instructors who were teaching at the time, for everybody doing research, but also for our students. And we learned a lot from their experience. And I want to share a few quotes and a little bit of data with you to kind of talk a bit about what our students are going through right now. And so this particular post was on Facebook, and it's from a student who said that they really lived in a non-ideal living situation, right? They didn't have their own room or even own space. So this can make studying extremely difficult, right? And one of their parents was unemployed, right? So there's employment issues that you might face as well, that students are really coming under financial hardship here. And also they felt obligated and had a lot more personal responsibilities that they were taking on in this role, especially where they're trying to help out, maybe getting new jobs to help support the family. And so what this boiled down to for this student is that their test scores and grades were clearly reflecting that change that they were experiencing. Right, so this is kind of a student is really going through something more that they might not during a regular quarter, right? Maybe they were living on campus originally, but now they're living in a situation that's not ideal for a learning environment. So I want to highlight this and use this to highlight that being curious about why your students aren't doing well in this particular situation, in this particular setting, is going to be a kind of important thing to think about. Right, so checking in with your students, the reason why they're not doing well might not be that they're not studying or not studying because they're being lazy or something, but really not studying because they don't have the time or they don't have the place. So thinking and checking in with your students is going to be a big thing. Now, again, we're relating this to assessments, right? And so if you don't have a quiet space of your own and you're taking a test, it's going to be really difficult for you to focus. So that brings in this idea of cognitive load, where they're just completely overloaded and can't focus. Again, I just want to share a little bit of data from this UC Undergraduate Experience Survey that went out at the end of the year. And 3,000 students replied from UCLA. And what they found is that 40% of these students had additional family care responsibilities that maybe they didn't in a normal setting, right? So this is the effects of remote teaching or remote learning on their environment. And so a lot of them said they were concerned or felt particularly socially isolated. And several students, 18%, said they were concerned about their basic needs getting met. So worried about food or housing or shelter. And when they broke this down and they disaggregated this data by who was receiving Pell Grants and were maybe first generation students or transfer students, they found that a higher proportion of them were really the ones that were concerned about their basic needs. So when we're thinking about equity, these are some students that are higher risk or are some that we need to think about that we're not going to leave behind. We want to try to bring in and make things more equal together. So a few other things that students are most concerned about are really performing well. And so they're really thinking about the class environment and whether or not they're doing well. They really care about their education. They care about learning. But there's worry about mental health, and some of them mentioned being concerned that their professors aren't understanding, or maybe there's lacking empathy. So maybe there's some disconnect there where either a faculty member might not be aware of certain situations, or it's just not coming across, right? So how do we convey that? But some students did also mention and really were grateful when faculty said they were flexible. So when they were aware that faculty were flexible. So I'm seeing in the chat here just a question that I want to address before going on, and how as a lecturer, can you mitigate the problem of not having your own workspace or a student having to work? So that's a difficult question for sure. I do know there are a lot of resources on campus, and maybe we can share the link to that a little later. A lot of resources on campus for students, at least to get help in basic needs, for example. I believe there's some funding for lower income students to get some supplies. Rachel, is there anything else that you can think?
I think that, in terms of not having your own space, that's difficult, right? And so what I would do is survey your students ahead of time, find out where they might be anticipating having a problem, helping them troubleshoot that. I talk to my students about negotiating with their family members and seeing if there's a time, like if they only have a common space to study, like the dining room table, is there a time when people can agree that they can have that space to themselves for an hour or two? Is there an outdoor space? So it does take some negotiation. It does take, helping students explicitly learn how to talk to their families about what it means to be a student, right? And the culture of being a student. And like you just recognizing that that could be a challenge for some students, I think would be a lot to help them feel heard, to help them feel like they have support in being able to do that. But it may take a little coaching and recognition that, yeah, if you're working at home with your family and maybe you're a first generation college student, your family may not understand what it means to be a student and what that culture is like. And so helping them again be able to communicate that and talk with their families about that might be able to solve the problem. It's a great question.
So really what this boils down to, and it comes back to the question also, is this isn't business as usual. So if we try to continue on with our classes as if it is, that is really adding to the stress and the burden that these students are experiencing. So I think for this, using this to focus on assessing and thinking about what is most important and the most important things that you want students to get out of your class. Right? So what are the big picture things that you really want them to know and take away? So some examples might be communicating effectively in an oral presentation, or demonstrating the ability to read, evaluate, and interpret scientific studies. Maybe that's a big skill that you want them to take away. Maybe see how physics can be applied to better understand their worlds and biological systems. So these are just a few examples that came up from faculty before when they really reflected on this question: what is the big thing that you want your students to get out of my course?
Thanks, Katie. So for this next exercise, we're about to think about what you want students to get out of your course. So start to imagine that you're about to teach a course full of students, as we mostly are. Next, or can I just get all of the bullet points, please? Okay, great, thank you. So in 5 years, you run into one of these students and they remember you and remember taking a course in 2020. Now there's gonna be a Google Doc that's gonna be shared in the chat. In this Google Doc, please find your name and write down a few big picture things, a few core ideas that you would want your student to remember from your course. There's the Google Doc. So we're gonna give you a minute to think about your big ideas. And then lastly, we're gonna break out into rooms and share that with some of your roommates.
Thanks, Tammy. So if everybody opens the Google Doc, you should see your name. And then by your name, you can spend a few minutes, a minute or two, writing down some big ideas. The link to the Google Doc is in the chat. And if you're having any trouble finding it, just raise your hand or write in the chat. Yeah, if anyone is calling in and you don't have access to the Google Doc, that's fine. This may happen with your students too, right? So you want to let them know they can just write down on a piece of paper and then be ready to share with their group when they go into their breakout rooms. So I think we're ready to put everyone in breakout rooms. Are the breakout rooms ready?
I think we are good to go.
All right.
All right, so I tried to split you up all by discipline. And if you just take a look at the Google Doc, and we'll see you in a bit.
And we'll have, yeah, I think actually it's going to be more like 6 minutes because we're running a little behind. So I think we're going to give everybody 6 minutes in the breakout rooms. Okay. All right.
Okay. All righty.
Welcome back, everybody. There's a lot of writing going on, so that's great. Okay, so Jenny, I think you were gonna, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So hopefully everybody had a chance to think about some of their big ideas. And after attending the CEILS workshop myself, very similar to what you guys are doing, I realized that one of the big goals for my class was for students to feel comfortable about scientific arguments. so that when they encountered something about climate change or even COVID, they felt empowered to consider what was being said. But I also realized that I never provided my students with any opportunity to learn how to do this. Furthermore, it wasn't any part of, there was no assessment involved with that skill either. And so I started to make sure that my assessments did specifically address this idea, so that my students, one, would recognize that it was important, because as the quote on the slide says, if you don't assess what's important, what's assessed becomes important in the students' minds. And two, I wanted my students to have opportunities to actually practice this skill and receive feedback, and that would happen in the forms of these assessments. I also really had to make sure to talk to my students about why they were writing in a science class. A lot of my students feel like, you know, I teach general chemistry, so they're like, I'm not in North Campus for a reason. So I think it's really important that, you know, once we kind of have these big ideas and we have ways that we want to assess these things, these assessments may not be as traditional as the, you know, midterm or things like that. So it's good to talk to the students. And I found that the students are much more than accepting of having an assessment like an essay in their general chem classroom. So, so hopefully you guys have gotten some of the creative juices flowing as well. And we have some suggestions for how you guys can consider broadening your assessment plans.
Okay.
Great, we have Shauna up.
Yep.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. I'm Shauna, Senior Associate Director at CEILS. And we're going to talk about a list of alternative assessments that you can consider, and especially in equity considerations. And so this was originally created by a cross-campus committee. These are recommendations from Jan Reif and her team, who report to the Chancellor to really focus on best practices for assessment. What we learned from the spring about remote proctoring is that certainly the administration was recommending to not undertake it lightly because of privacy concerns, to provide explicit notice to the students if it were to be undertaken, and make sure that they look for alternatives where possible. What we heard from faculty, you know, as faculty were contacting CEILS and, you know, really stressed, what if Respondus crashes during my exam? What should my contingency plan be? What should you do if your student's Wi-Fi dropped? Should you assume they were cheating? And so all of that coming together is to realize that timed and remotely proctored exams were resulting in particularly high stress, and to think about who they're stressing in particular, right? They're the students with the broadband hardware and scanning, uploading issues. For folks who are wondering like if it affects their students, somebody did do a study on UCLA life science majors in spring 2020, and they found that 29% of them had technology issues or concerns. And folks saying things like, my house is loud most of the time and there are family tensions. I don't have a dedicated space of work to do. I think you all talked about this in the beginning, but I have 3 people trying to stream videos. Sometimes my internet cuts out, which makes things really stressful with quizzes or discussion participation. And I want to clarify, this doesn't mean that we need to make everything easier for everybody. It means we want to find assessments that let people learn and demonstrate their learning in other ways, in addition to if you need to do these timed exams in addition to that. So in our survey from you all from beginning, more than 85% of you came into this saying, okay, I'm open to alternative forms of assessment. And there were some folks who were like, I can't, there's no other, like I have to do individual remote proctoring, which makes sense. So we have best practices. But I also want anybody who has to do individual remote proctoring to think about these other options as ways to reduce the weight of that, as ways to allow your students to demonstrate their learning in other ways. So we want to give you principles that you can try to apply to your own course of more equitable and less equitable. So less equitable are these primarily high stakes proctored exams, and more equitable would be different forms of assessment so students can demonstrate their learning in different ways, written, speaking. Less equitable would be to assess only the skills that you think are critical to your discipline. I mean, this is how I thought about it. Like when you're enmeshed in physics, that's what you want to assess. But assess and build the skills from your discipline that are most relevant to the student careers. So if your students aren't going to go into your specific field, what do they need from your field for what they are going into? And then finally, it's less equitable. Some faculty will limit information about the exam so that students, and that means that students who have the time can just study everything. But it's more equitable to be transparent and clear, and more than you think you need to, about expectations, so that students won't have to guess how best to prepare. And this, I'm not advocating to give a practice exam that looks just like your exam at all. But you can give a practice exam that has totally different questions but a similar format to your exam, right? Or something from last year's exam, or you can tell them, you know, how many multiple choice questions will there be, and then how many problems will they have to solve. First, let them know the structure. Give them practice beforehand. So I want to help you all think about what skills do you need to help your students build to get a job? Because none of us in academia often think of like real jobs, or at least I don't. And how can your assessments be linked to those skills? So in a survey, a national survey of employers put out by the Association of American Colleges and Universities, 90% of employers want their employees to communicate orally and effectively, or to make ethical judgment and decision making, to work effectively in teams, to apply knowledge to real world settings, and then to analyze and solve complex problems. And so think about your own skills that you're focusing on, and are there any skills you want to integrate in this remote world that are valued by people outside of academia? For those of us, almost a lot of people here teach pre-health students in some form. And so I want to show the American Association of Medical Colleges core competencies. And they do have critical thinking, you know, living systems, human behavior, and they have a lot on written communication and reasoning and social skills. So recognizing this is valuable for our students if they can demonstrate learning of that. Okay, so this bridge can be really difficult and scary, from traditional assessments on one side to our more equitable, authentic, and real world assessments. And so we're not pretending it's easy. We're here, CEILS is here. A lot of your colleagues and resources are doing things, and we encourage you to use student feedback to refine it, because it's hard to do things you haven't done before. What I'm going to do next is give you an overview of different options, because everyone will have different options that work best for them. And you've all practiced renaming yourself. So rename yourself to indicate the one or two options you want to discuss further in your breakout room. So I'll go through this and then it'll make more sense, but I want you to get ready to rename yourself if you want to express interest. So one option is to decrease the need for proctoring, is to have open book, open note, take home exams, right? And so ideas for making sure this is still the student's own work is you can ask the students to write down their explanations, interpretations, or justifications in their own words, and then use Turnitin to detect their plagiarism, detect if that's happening. Again, it's not perfect, because if you're solving quantitative problems, then Turnitin doesn't assess that. But if you ask students to explain their reasoning, that's good for them to do anyways, and Turnitin can detect if their reasoning is the same. So it can force them to articulate that. Ask questions that require students to make connections to their own experiences. So if it's a specific where they live, or where they work, or what they do, it's harder to just look online and cheat off of that. They need to think about it and connect it to their world. Critical equity considerations that we recommend, but you can decide is appropriate, is offer at least 24 hours to complete. With CCLE, you can make a 3-hour exam available within a 24-hour range, and provide example problems before the exam to build the skills. So if you're shifting your exam, give them sample problems for them to practice on. And we're gonna have a handout that summarizes all this. So I'll go through it quickly, but you'll see a handy table that summarizes it. Another idea is allowing collaboration on exams. And again, I'm not saying that all exams should be all entirely group work, but there's something called a 2-stage exam that's been happening in a lot of your departments in various ways, where individuals do it first and then a group portion follows it. And there's a link that I don't know if one of my co-facilitators can share in the chat, but it's also on our assessment doc of how to do that online. For equity considerations, do think that you want to assign groups, because studies repeatedly find that marginalized students are likely to be excluded when they're self-selecting groups. So, and then also ideally provide other opportunities for group functioning to build. And the things that are great about 2-stage exams is students say, you actually learn what you got wrong right away from a different student. And so they turn the exams into learning experiences. Decrease the need for proctoring by having weekly quizzes. So this will reduce the stakes. And this maybe you can have time. If you need to have it timed, tell the students in advance. But that way they have these weekly quizzes. You can shuffle the questions and responses, so you make it a little harder. And you can add questions that prompt the students to explain their reasoning. So that they have to explain their reasoning separately. For folks who are like, my discipline doesn't do multiple choice, you can think about multiple choice quizzes where you give answers and then different reasoning for the answer. So the students have to distinguish the different reasoning that's going on there. Okay. So let's see, do you need your students, another option, if you need your students to write or draw on assessments, I'm gonna hand this over to Katie, actually. Katie?
Yeah, so a lot of the time, folks who, when you have to write more on an exam, are concerned about work for their TAs maybe, or being consistent in the grading. And so GradeScope is actually a tool that you can use that helps with transparency for your students when you do the grading. So it's a rubric-based online grading platform, and it also allows students to, maybe if it's something they have to draw or you know, have to write out an equation, they can take a picture of that and upload it, and make it, you could still annotate it the way that you would maybe another doc. So one of the things that's great about it is when TAs really enjoy it, the ones that I've talked to, because it does make grading very transparent. But I do want to just make a couple points of, for equity's sake, you know, don't assume your students can print. Not everybody has a printer at home, for example. Survey students about their ability beforehand. So if you are going to ask them to scan or upload something, ask if they have that equipment available or they're able to do that. And then for those who have less reliable internet, this might be a little bit of a way to be less anxious about a timed exam. So for that issue of timed exams, at least uploading maybe could relieve that a little bit.
Okay. Another thing that you can do is, well, Jay, you have a question. Would you like to ask your question, Jay?
Yeah, before you get started on that, if students have problems with some kind of assignment or whatever you're doing, I think it's better to have thought ahead of time about alternate ways of doing assessment for that student, because you know, you may have designed the best thing for students who don't have difficulties, but you know, rather than say, well, I just can't do this because there are 2 students or 10% can't have problems, maybe you can have the other 10% do something else, which they may not be totally thrilled about, but it's better than just throwing everything out, I think.
I think there's also, a principle, one of the principles of universal design is to, an equity-minded approach is to design your assessments so that everyone can do them, right? And so when you design for those who might need different types of accommodations or different types of approaches, everyone will benefit from that. So it's just a kind of another way to think about it, because then it makes it accessible for everyone.
Okay. But I do want to add, if you feel like you need to proctor and recognize that there are 5 to 10% of students that would find that hard to do, I think that accommodating those students somehow, having an anonymous survey to reveal the percentage and who they are, is still a better approach than having everybody try to do this less equitable thing.
And they also appreciate that you're making special arrangements. I mean, you know, you should make it so that they appreciate that you're doing something for them.
Yeah, exactly. I think the hardest thing is making it safe. They need that. So setting an environment where everybody can feel comfortable asking for that if they need it. Thank you, Jay. Thanks for contributing that. So the other, I think this is the last one I was going to talk about, is thinking about projects, case studies, papers, and presentations. So 60% of UCLA science majors in the spring were asked to work with classmates outside of class, the ones who responded. There's a lot of different options, and there's important equity considerations. So you want to structure the student's progress, especially in a first-year course if they're not used to writing these things. think about how synchronous presentations could be challenging. And if they're group presentations, we really want to encourage you to assign groups somehow based on student schedules or topics of interest. Ways to reduce grading for large courses are to have it be structured with clear milestones so that the students are learning along the way rather than just doing something that's not very good and then you get it at the end and you spend your whole winter break grading these miserable projects, right? So give them milestones and then have them reflect on group functioning, and you can incorporate individual accountability by having them grade one another and their contributions. But I only recommend doing that if they're also discussing openly with one another how they're each doing. So at this point, I don't know, can you raise your hand if you're teaching a large class? Because I want to kind of see your hands and I can see this gallery. Oh, okay. Yeah, some people are raising virtual hands, real hands. Yeah, and so
how large is your large?
let's say more than, anybody who doesn't want to grade more than 20 projects at the end of the quarter. But I'm just saying, I'm pointing out that a lot of they increase the grading load, which they do. And so I do want to share something called the CCLE workshop tool. Not a perfect solution because nothing is, but what it does is it has peers grade one another using a rubric that the instructor creates. And they also grade themselves, so it forces them to look at the rubric. There's motivation for the student to grade carefully because they get points off if they grade differently from the other people who graded the same assignment. So it's like a peer review process. I've tried it. I'm happy to talk with you about it if you're thinking about it. We have an example rubric that you can think about. Rubrics can be really valuable, and we have a link to more rubric resources in the doc I'm going to share with you. When making the rubric, use it to decrease the need for student assumptions. And if you want the students to be able to figure out what they have to do, start with a detailed rubric and then make it less detailed towards the end of the quarter so that you're scaffolding. What it has the students do is reflect on where and why they lost points. So it forces your students to look at where they lost points, learn about why, and then they look back at what they wrote before their next exam. To reduce grading, you can just grade for completion and indicate you will spot check. So now we're going to get you ready for your breakouts, which means we'll ask you to rename yourself to indicate what you're interested in testing. And this is just a quick way to make sure that everyone in your group can see what you're interested in talking about. So, okay, I think we're ready to go to our next breakouts. If Katie's ready to put us there. So in breakout 2, you'll discuss the alternative that you have, that your group has the most interest in. And then think about some challenges with this alternative and brainstorm ways to overcome or adapt to these challenges.
And we have how much time for this?
I'd say 8 minutes. Let's do 8 minutes.
All right, 8 minutes.
Great. So hopefully in discussing those alternatives, you were able to kind of brainstorm and get some different ideas from your peers or colleagues about other alternatives. So now we're going to kind of turn to your own assessments, right? And we're going to give you a little bit of time to work together, or just work individually on your own assessment. And we'll give you 5 minutes, actually, not 15, where you can maybe turn down your volume, but definitely if you do, use the timer. But the facilitators will be in the room to provide any feedback if you do have questions. So in this work time, we have a couple options where you can either consider the types of assessments you want to use and how you might rearrange the point breakdown for those assessments, maybe on your syllabus, for example. Or maybe another idea is to go through one of the assessments that you brought, maybe you have a final exam, and go through and determine what could be moved somewhere else or assessed in a different way. So maybe take some notes. And then after, we're going to have a little debrief discussion with the rest of the group as we're in the breakout rooms. And so this is kind of shown on the Google Docs. Let's see here. So Jenny, are you?
Yeah, sorry, I was responding to the chat. Yeah, so one of the activities that you may want to consider doing with this time is just to think about what assessments you currently have in the class and see if maybe those bigger assessments can be broken down into smaller, more varied assessments so that you create an environment where students can show you and demonstrate their knowledge in in a variety of diverse ways.
Yeah, so again, we're going to send you into breakout rooms right now. It's again on the Google Doc. So at the bottom, you can see the different instructions there or ideas of what you can do. And there's a link to some examples as well if you get stuck. So I am going to open the rooms, and during this time, take about 5 minutes to look and have some quiet reflection time on your own assessment.
All right. Welcome back, everybody. Okay, so I think in our last few minutes, Shauna was going to take us through some best practices for remote testing, yeah?
Yep. Okay. Thank you. Someone else is sharing the screen, which is great. So we recognize that in some classes, and this is across the country, this is true, intro physics and chem and math courses are often struggling with this proctoring individual exams. So next slide, please, if we need to do that. We have this summary, and it's also on the docs that we've handed out, that you want to let the students know in advance that you're going to do proctoring. You want to select the format and make that clear, select the proctoring tool, make sure you accommodate students with disabilities, communicate the instructions at least a week before the exam, and have everybody do a few, offer a few mock exam sessions so that you're at least reducing the anxiety level that students are feeling around this, and indicate what would make the exam void in different things. And then during the exam, you might want to turn off your CCLE site if you don't want them working on that. You can adjust settings to increase Zoom security in ways that we have on our doc. And yeah, you can have the student have the microphone unmuted and camera pointed at their face. You can pin or spotlight people. Everyone's coming to us with problems related to this, right? If you have multiple devices, this really doesn't stop them. We're just trying to say that if you feel like this is something you have to do, these are the practices that seem to be recognized as best practices. Okay, next slide. If you're looking for more details on the assessments, we have that table and this checklist, and it'll guide you through it. I'm going to update the two-stage exam link as soon as I can find it. Sorry that that's broken, but we shared other two-stage exam links. And let us know if there's anything that's missing from there, and we'll add resources to it. And next slide.
Okay.
Rachel.
Yeah, so the last thing that we just want to leave you with is no matter what assessments that you use, you want to have in mind who might be in those situations where those assessments may disadvantage them or exclude students, and then how you can adapt, what kind of plan you can have in place to adapt and mitigate that. And then also just to think about as instructors, the way that you choose to assess students can really affirm their belonging, right? It's particularly the racially minoritized students, by providing them with a variety of different ways to demonstrate their learning and demonstrate their knowledge and articulate their thinking process. And that will make it more equitable for everyone. And we talked a little bit about this in our group, is just this idea of setting that tone right at the beginning, of having a welcoming environment where students are responsible for their own learning, and that you're articulating that and being very explicit about how you are creating that in your classroom. So anything you can do to kind of minimize this urge to cheat, right? We know that that is out there. And so whatever you can do to create that climate in your classroom that makes you approachable, makes students feel like they can come to you if they're in trouble, or if they're struggling, or if they're having any issues. And so finally, we know that students appreciate when faculty are flexible and that when they're responsive, and so they hear you. They do respond to that and know that when they know that you're responding to them, it does make a difference in terms of their attitudes. So that is what we have for you today. Thank you everybody for coming. We totally would appreciate your feedback, and so please take just a few minutes to let us know how this went for you, what your experience was. If there are any ways that we can improve, we are very open to that and really would love to hear from you about that. And that is all we have. So thanks, everybody. Good luck. You're all doing an awesome job. It's hard work.